Greetings friends and welcome to Premium Light Academy. We are your one-stop shop for improving your photography skills. Welcome back to chapter 5 of our Lightroom for Beginners lesson. Now if you're just now joining us, please go back and watch chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. That will make chapter 5 make so much more sense. We're coming up on the home stretch. In this lesson, we will learn how to export our files out of Lightroom for safekeeping. So let's get started. All right, friends, welcome back to Lightroom for Beginners. We are now in part 5, exporting your images. If you're just now joining us, I certainly recommend that you go back to part 1. We've covered a lot of really important information up to this point. We're at the final stretch, so it definitely makes sense that you go back and watch from the beginning. So before we launch into Lightroom itself, I want to talk a little bit about some file structuring. Over here on the desktop, I have a folder called Ashley Wheatfield Summer 2021. Now, I know that file organization is not always the most glamorous part of photography, but it is very important that we stay organized, especially as your portfolio continues to grow. Here we see a series of folders. We have HD, JPEG, PSD, meaning Photoshop document, and TIFF. Now, it will certainly be clear what we're going to use these folders for in just a minute, so let's jump into Lightroom to begin. Here we have our final selections from the advanced development module that we did last time. So to give a quick summary, let's go back into all photographs. I'll make our thumbnails nice and small so we can see that we did in fact start with 3 unique photo shoots. We had Ashley in the wheat field, we had Ashley in kind of a Sundance, and then we had Ashley in front of this sort of flowering hedge. For this lesson series, we stayed focused on Ashley in the wheat field. We took all of our images from the library and we started to parse things down. We went into our collections panel and we created lots of different collections. We started off with Ashley in the wheat field here. Then we made an initial round of edits, coming down to 13 files, and then we finalized that with our final cut. These are the final 7 files that made it into the development module. When we take a closer look, we can see that each of these images has in fact been beautifully edited in Lightroom. And now that we're done with our Lightroom process, we need to export these files so that we can share them with the world. Now, for many photographers, Lightroom is the one and only photo editing tool that they use. Maybe you just take pictures for fun, maybe you take pictures of friends and family, maybe you just take pictures for yourself. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Again, for a great many photographers, Lightroom is the one and only editing tool that we will use. For the pro photographer, for the more advanced, Lightroom is not the final step. In fact, it could be said that Lightroom is really just the beginning, because once we get done with our initial edits here, we're going to export these images over into Photoshop and we're going to undertake a very sophisticated series of skin retouching and light painting edits. Photoshop is designed to make images as absolutely perfect as they possibly can be. So if you're shooting for a magazine or a publication or an advertising agency, you're definitely going to want to drop these images into Photoshop and keep that editing workflow going. However, because this is just a beginner's tutorial, we don't really want to go down the Photoshop rabbit hole too far. So for beginner purposes, we are going to assume that Lightroom is basically your one and only tool that you're going to use to edit these images. And that's perfectly fine, because what we have so far is a really beautiful selection of finely tuned images that are going to look absolutely great no matter where you send them off to. So let's see what we can do. Right now, these images basically all just live inside the Lightroom library. Right now, I'm basically just looking at raw files from inside the camera. Yes, we have made edits to those raw files, but basically what I need to do now is I need to export these images out of Lightroom so that those edits will actually be applied to the raw files so that when the final viewer sees the images, they will get these beautiful final images. So I'm going to hit the G key on the keyboard and let's look at a basic library view. Ultimately, what I want to do is I want to export these final 7 images so that I can share them with my friends. We will be exporting these images in several different formats because there is no one universal format that works for everything. Let's say you want to email these pictures to a friend or a client. Let's say that you want to text these images to some of your friends. Let's say you want to share these images on social media. In that case, you're going to want to use a much smaller file. Lightroom can certainly be used to export images of that nature. But let's say that we also want to archive these files into our photo portfolio so that we will always have the big, gigantic, full resolution image. Maybe someday down the line we want to print one of these images. Maybe we want to give it as a gift. Maybe we want to send it to a magazine. In that case, we need to have a much larger file format than what we would use to send out on the internet. So I like to begin with my large format archival images first, and then work my way down to smaller and smaller images after that. So here we are in the library. I am selected on my Ashley Wheatfield Final Cut. These are the images that we edited in our previous modules. They look beautiful. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select all of these images. I'm gonna go to my Export tab. Now when we pop this button open, we should see a new dialog box. Basically, Lightroom is asking us a series of questions. Where do you want your files to go? What do you want to name them? And what format should they be in? So let's start up here with file location. First thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click choose. Now, basically, Lightroom is asking me, where do I wanna put these files? As we saw in the beginning of the lesson, on the desktop, I have created a single folder called Ashley Wheatfield Summer. So when I click one time on this folder, I am left once again with these previous subcategories that we discussed earlier. I have HD, I have JPEG, I have PSD, and I have TIFF. Now, since we are going to create the largest files first, we're going to start big and then we're going to work our way down to small. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on TIFF, and I'm going to click choose. Basically, that has directed Lightroom to send these images to the TIFF folder that I have just designated. And I can see that file path right here. Users, desktop, Ashley Wheatfield Summer, TIFF, that's where these files are going. Lightroom gives you the opportunity to put these files once again into another subfolder. If I were to click this button, Lightroom would automatically create a subfolder called web inside of this TIFF folder. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to click that off, and I'm actually going to just delete that right now. I just want to send these files to this one folder that we have designated. Next, we're going to move down one panel to the file naming category. Basically, Lightroom gives you the ability to rename your files, and we definitely want to do this because I want to keep my files as organized as possible. So in this first section here, I have a section that says custom name and sequence. If I click this open, I am faced with something that should look very familiar from the very first chapter that we did. We have a series of options. I personally like custom name and sequence. This basically means that I can type in any name that I want, and Lightroom will say, okay, cool, -1, -2, -3 sequence. So let's select this, and let's give this a name. I'm going to call this Ashley Wheatfield Summer 2021. And let's go ahead and throw in a quick archive. I'm going to add the title archive onto the end because basically that means that this file is going to be a TIFF file. And that brings us down to our next section. These are not videos, so we can twirl this up. File settings, here is where we go. I'm going to twirl this down. Okay, image format. Basically, we've told the file where we want it to go. We've given it a name, and now we need to give it a format. So Lightroom gives you another couple of options. When I twirl this button open, I get a series of choices. At the top, I have JPEG, Photoshop document, TIFF, PNG, DNG for digital negative, and or original. Now for this particular instance, I want to choose TIFF. So what is a TIFF file? A TIFF file is basically a super large format, fine art, non-compressed file. It's basically the same thing as a raw file. It has a huge amount of data. Nothing is being compressed as it is with a JPEG. And you're basically keeping all of your original information, all of your pixel information, and all of your color information completely intact. So this is how we want to archive our full-size files. So compression, let's go with none. Bit depth, now this is something that a lot of photographers will probably argue about. You have 18-bit compression, you have 10-bit compression. For portraits, I typically like to leave things on 8-bit. There is more than enough color information in 8-bit in order to continue to produce, print, or work on any portrait file after it leaves the Lightroom export module. So we're going to create an archival TIFF file. The color space, you always want to make sure that you're in Adobe 1998. This gives you the broadest color gambit for future reference. Again, printing, editing, Adobe 1998. Let's keep it there. Next, we move down to one final section. We have image sizing. Now, if I were to click this button right here, resize to fit, basically I can tell Lightroom you can make this image smaller or effectively any size that you want. I don't want to click this button on right now because right now I have selected a width of 1600 pixels by 1600 pixels tall at a resolution of 300 pixels. Basically, I'm turning my image into a web-sized image. I would be drastically shrinking this image. I would be destroying pixels. I would be taking it down from a gigantic 8,000 by 5,000 pixel 5DSR file to a tiny little web file. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is leave this button checked off. When this is checked off, Lightroom will automatically default to the full size file. So when I leave this button off, I know that I am exporting that full gigantic raw file that came out of that 5DSR camera. So moving down the line, we have output sharpening. I don't want to sharpen my image. I don't really need to worry myself with metadata. I don't need to watermark this file, and I don't need to have any post-processing notes. So let's just leave those closed off for now. All right, so starting from the top, basically I've given the file a location. I've told it where to go. Next, I've given it a name. This is going to keep us organized for future reference. I've told the file what format I want it to be. I want it to be a large format archival TIFF file, and I've told it that I want it to be the full size straight out of that big ticket 5DSR camera. So now when I click the export button, Lightroom is going to go to work exporting these images with their edits intact into that folder that I have specified. If we look up here in this top corner, we can see a progress bar, and it's going to show me just how quickly those files go out of Lightroom and get archived into their new location. All right, so now that this first batch of images has been exported, let's reduce Lightroom, minimize that, and let's look into our folder that we've created here. So I am once again on the desktop, I have the wheat field, and as you can see right now, the folder entitled TIFF has now been populated with freshly exported files from our Lightroom session. So each of these images is a full-size archival TIFF file. As you can see over here, it was created today at 5:23 p.m. It is in fact 8,000 by 5,000 pixels at a resolution of 300. So we have created an archival TIFF file of our image. So that takes care of the big guns. Let's go back into Lightroom and let's do the exact same process over once again. So I have all of my files selected. I'm going to go down to the export tab. Let's click export. And in this case, I'm actually going to leave most of my parameters the same. I am going to choose a different folder because we are no longer creating TIFF files. We are now going to back up and create JPEG files. So essentially I'm going to create all the exact same files, only we're going to change up the format and create JPEG. So I'm choosing that location for JPEG. I'm going to leave the names the same. I can actually create a little thing here. I don't need to say that they're archival anymore. I'm just going to delete that out of the title. And let's go down to our file settings. Now I'm going to create JPEG files. Now, JPEGs are really great for a number of reasons. Number one, they use a very powerful compression algorithm to make the file quite a bit smaller. This means that they're easy to move around. You can move them around the internet, you can move them around your smartphone, your tablet. Wherever you need a JPEG file to work out for you, it pretty much will. A JPEG is universally read by almost any computer or digital device in the world. Now, in this case, these JPEG files are in fact still full size. We are not doing anything to resize the image. We're basically just creating some full-size JPEGs because they're very handy to have. So once again, let's click export. If we go up into our module here, we're going to see that Lightroom will once again export those JPEG files. And if we minimize Lightroom and look into our file folder structure, now when I click on JPEG, I have a series of JPEG files. These are all identical to the first set of TIFFs that I exported, except these are now in JPEG format. As you can see, when I look by comparison, this file is 30 megabytes. Now that's a pretty huge file, but Basically, what this is a JPEG compression algorithm. It's a very high quality compression. It means that I get a small file size with lots of extra quality. But when I look at the TIFF file, this has no compression whatsoever. Let's look at that exact same file. And you can see this is 151 megabytes. So a TIFF file is absolutely gigantic. It loses no information. It does no compression, whereas the JPEG file gives us a superb amount of quality, but it does in fact drastically reduce that file size. So if you were going to send this full-size image to a publication or a magazine, a JPEG would probably be okay in this instance because this is in fact a full-size file. Next, let's go back into Lightroom once again, and we're going to repeat this process all over again. Let's select all of our images. Let's hit the export button, and this time we are going to create yet another JPEG, but we're going to make this one a little bit smaller. So let's choose the HD folder. Now in the old school definition, HD basically stood for HD television. It was 1920 by 1080 pixels. The days of HD are somewhat long gone now that we live in a world of 4K and even 8K, but I tend to still use the old terminology HD, as high definition means something of a large digital quality, but not quite gigantic print archival quality. So we're just going to choose the HD folder, and I'll explain a little bit more about how this works. Let's click choose. Alright, now in my nomenclature, I have Ashley Wheatfield Summer, and I'm going to add a little moniker on the end here that says HD, because I don't want my HD files getting confused with my regular full-size JPEGs. This will all make sense in just a minute. When we go down to image size, I am actually going to click resize to fit. And what I want to do here is I want to set my resolution to 72 dpi, which is a basic screen resolution, whether you're looking at a TV or a monitor. And then I'm going to go over to my actual pixel dimensions, and I'm going to set this to 3600 by 3600. So basically this means that Lightroom will create files that are 3600 pixels wide or 3600 pixels tall, depending on whether you're in the vertical portrait orientation or the horizontal landscape orientation. Now, why would I shrink my file size? Why wouldn't I always want to have those gigantic 8,000 pixel files? Well, the truth of the matter is that you really don't need that much resolution when it comes to digital devices. Let's say that I want to put some pictures on my phone or on my tablet or on my computer or on a website or on social media. I don't need images that are 8,000 pixels wide. That's just too big. It's going to clog up the pipeline, it's going to slow things down, and it's going to make it impossible for you to be able to show your pictures. So basically all we're doing here is we're just creating a smaller, more compact sample of the images that we have. So once again, I'm going to click export. And as we go up, we're going to watch Lightroom export this series of images. All right, now let's once again minimize Lightroom and look at what we've just done. When I navigate towards the HD folder, once again, I have the same 7 images. They now all have this HD moniker on the end of them so that I know I'm not going to get them confused with a full-size JPEG. But when I click on this file, let's look at what happens. We have drastically reduced the file size. We're now only 4.8 megabytes in size. We are now 3,600 pixels by 2,400 pixels tall. So if I get kind of a full-size preview of that file, you can see that it still looks great on the computer. So if I wanted to put these images on my smartphone or on my tablet, if I want to email them to a client as samples, if I want to text them to a friend, or if I want to basically keep my entire portfolio in my pocket, I can load these images onto my smartphone. I don't need to put an 8,000 pixel, 150 megabyte archival TIFF file on my iPhone. All I really need is this nice looking image that's been reduced and optimized for a digital device. So as you can see, this was a little bit of a laborious process. We repeated ourselves several times. We created TIFF files, we created JPEG files, and we created HD files. All of these images in and of themselves are identical. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, some of them are compressed, but all of them are really good. And this leaves us with our final folder, PSD, Photoshop Documents. Let's jump back into Lightroom one last time. Now, if you are like most people and you basically just want to shoot better pictures, you want to share your images with friends, we're pretty much done at this point. However, if you are a professional photographer, there is in fact one more step that we have to do, Exporting images out of Lightroom is not good enough to send to a magazine, publication, or television station. These images still need yet another round of edits, and this is where we will export our Photoshop documents, send them to Photoshop, and proceed to do a bunch of really high-end retouching using frequency separation, light painting, all kinds of other tactics. So I can once again export all of these files as Photoshop documents. Let's just take a look at how this is accomplished. I no longer need my HD moniker over here, so I'm just gonna delete that. I'm going to aim our new files at our PSD Photoshop document folder. Let's click choose there. And we've given this a title, and now we need to change the format to PSD Photoshop document. Once again, I need to make sure that this is clicked off. I don't want to resize my giant Photoshop documents. I want to have access to all of my pixels and all of my color information. So as I click export here one last time, Lightroom is going to very diligently produce 7 gigantic uncompressed Photoshop documents that I can then use to edit in Photoshop. Now, when we minimize this one last time and we look into our Photoshop document folder, we can see that we have 7 new files. Let's just expand that a little bit. And if I look at one of these, I can see that they are roughly the size of those big ticket uncompressed TIFF files. A Photoshop document, when it's freshly exported from Lightroom, is essentially a flattened file. It has all of its color information, it has all of its size, and it is an absolutely gigantic file. Now, if I were to open this in Photoshop and start creating layers and adjustment layers and doing retouching, this file size would balloon up to probably about 500 megabytes. However, since this is a Lightroom for Beginners tutorial, we don't want to go down the Photoshop rabbit hole. I know we've been down a lot of rabbit holes so far, but that's definitely not one that we're ready to get into just yet. So let's go back into Lightroom. And I want to say, for the most part, we've done a lot of really great work in a short amount of time. None of this is brain surgery. Now, if you're new to Lightroom, if you're new to photography, Lightroom is a really, really great tool for you to be able to get in there and dig into your raw editing and make some really, really beautiful images right off the bat. Like I say, Lightroom is the beginning and the end of the road for a great many photographers out there, and if you've made it this far, you have produced some beautiful, beautiful images. So this should wrap up our lesson on exporting your images from Lightroom. I certainly hope you've had a good time during this series. I hope you learned a lot, I hope you had fun, and more importantly, I hope you'll keep coming back for more lessons. We do in fact have one final bonus lesson at the end of this tutorial where we start from scratch and we really lightning round our way through a whole bunch of edits. We're going to start in the library, we're going to hone our images down, we're going to do some quick edits, we're going to export, and we're going to show you the entire process all in one final condensed episode. So be sure to come back for that bonus episode. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, and as always, we'll see you in the next lesson. All right, friends, as always, thank you so much for joining us. This concludes Chapter 5 of our Lightroom for Beginners. We've now come full circle in our workflow. We started off by importing our files, we organized our images, we edited our images, and then we exported them for safekeeping. But the fun doesn't have to stop here. We have one more bonus episode for you. We're gonna do that entire workflow in one quick lightning round. You don't wanna miss it. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. We have a lot of cool new stuff coming up, and I don't want you to miss out. So we'll see you in the next lesson.